Thank you. Thank you very much, Catherine, and back right at you. A lot of people here who've been doing the same stuff for decades. So I think we're all in very, very proud and fine company. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am at the moment, Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, same as Catherine, and acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which we meet from various parts of Australia, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. It's my great pleasure to be facilitating this evening, and I want to again thank IPAN for organising this webinar in the Alternative Defence series with the title, as Catherine has indicated, Restructuring the ADF as a Self-Reliant Force, concentrating on territorial defence of Australia only and without foreign assistance. So that's what we're addressing this evening. These conversations about the most appropriate form of defence for Australia are really, really important, because there is a lot at stake. We're up against a lot of mainstream media commentary, which doesn't want to know about alternatives to just arming ourselves, preparing for yet another war, and continuing our record of joining just about every US war that's going. And alternatives to this are rarely mentioned by our political leaders, which makes these discussions all the more important. So this evening, we're delighted to have two very distinguished guests to kick off and lead our discussions, Dr. Albert Palazzo and Dr. Mike Gilligan. I'll introduce them each in turn. Each will speak for up to about 15 minutes, and then we will have some Q&A after both speakers. Q&A of hopefully of about 40 minutes, and we aim to finish by 7:20-ish, 7:30 at the latest. So please, in the usual fashion, use the chat for any questions or comment, and Annette Brownlee and I, between us, will keep the best eye we can on the chat line to draw some of the questions for the Q&A session. So I'm going to introduce first Dr. Al Palazzo, who is adjunct professor at the University of New South Wales in Canberra. Formerly, he was the Director of War Studies in the Australian Army Research Centre, which is a part of the Australian Army headquarters. He's written articles on alternative defence for Australia, including on armed neutrality, and also a paper on planning not to lose, which sounds like a good plan. Good idea. His next book is on climate change and its implications for national security. He hopes his writings will encourage a rethink both within the Army and in the public domain of the best defence policies for Australia in the current times. Terrific goals there, which we would all endorse, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you, Al. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. I'm going to again try to share the screen, and okay, that seems to have worked. So I just wanted to quickly, talk about what we need to be aiming for when we're talking about security, about how to make Australia secure for the future. And for me, it's this ability for us to make our decisions free of outside restraint and interference. We've never actually been totally secure, but then nobody ever is. Even the great powers have to make compromises.
To hear it?
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead, Al. Yep, that's good.
Okay. So even the United States has never had absolute security, but our goal should be to have as much as possible. And since the nation's founding, Australia's done this through three courses of action. And the one that we're most familiar with, the one that dominates a lot of attention, is that we've got a big partner who's offering protection to us. And that's currently the United States. And because of that, we get involved in various things that the United States, does. But we also, Australia also takes an active role in international organizations and also attempts to shape the region in its interest, both the Southeast Asian region and also the Pacific Island region. But at present, and it tends to go this way through most of Australia's history, the balance is skewed towards number one, where we rely on the great power to do that. And we're just still doing this now. And as the world is becoming, more dangerous or tensions are rising across the world, we seem to be looking to the big partner even more so. And I think AUKUS, that new agreement with the United States, which nobody knows what it consists of, is reflection of that. But what is the consequences of this, overbalance towards number one, towards the great power? And many of us think about that, consequences being participation in U.S. wars. And certainly that has been the case. But there's also more than that. It also means that we design our defense force so that it can work with the U.S. Defense Force. So we take active roles in creating capabilities, military capabilities that either the U.S. likes or which can be subsumed into the American military system. And we saw that in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the latest iteration of this is the decision to, spend $100 billion. I have plus there because nobody knows how much more than 100 billion is going to be. I won't even hazard a guess, but we're building these nuclear-powered submarines, technology that the United States will loan to us or share with us, and then we'll build them in Adelaide. And that is also another aspect of the insurance policy, turning to the United States and getting technology from them and investing in it.
Fuck me.
What was that? I think the submarine deal is a terrible deal for Australia, and I think it's something that we really don't need. And I have nothing against submarines, and I think we do need submarines in our defense force. We just don't need nuclear-powered ones that are optimized to work with the U.S. Navy. And so I'm just going to go through a list of reasons, why these are a bad deal. There could be more reasons than this, but I think, and this is the primary one, is that the strategic rationale for acquiring these submarines makes no sense. No matter how many times I've looked at it and looked at it from different angles, I keep coming to the same conclusion. Building or acquiring nuclear-powered submarines for a country like Australia in Australia's defense situation is just daft. There's no legitimate strategic rationale. And the government really hasn't offered a strategic rationale that makes any sense, other than saying that we're going to deter China. And it's something that the United States would appreciate us doing. The idea here is that we're going to have one, once we get these submarines, they're going to be able to sail into the East China Sea and somehow intimidate China into doing what we want them to do. And this seems really high risk and just an absurd level of return here. It's just not going to happen. And what it does mean is that we're probably going to end up in a major war with China, with the United States, and these submarines will be part of that deal. Now, I also want to talk, that one of the great things here that, really scares me is that, commentators out there, defense commentators, I'm, one of the few, a handful of people who actually seem to remember that nuclear weapons exist. Most commentators out there will blithely talk about a coming war with China and seem to overlook the fact that that China is nuclear armed and as such, runs a risk of the annihilation of the human race. because if pressed and escalation occurs and we cross the nuclear threshold and we see an exchange of nuclear bombs between China and the United States, millions, if not billions, of people will die. And those who are making these decisions or part of the defense commentariat seem to no longer have any fear of nuclear weapons, which existed in the Cold War, but now is just blithely dismissed as, we won't have to really worry about that. Now, of course, for political reasons, we're going to build these submarines in Australia, even though we don't have a clue how to do it and have never built anything on the level of sophistication that these vessels represent. But they're going to be built here. And this is on a level of fantasy here by our political leaders. These are really complex. This is probably the most complex thing you could build, perhaps second to sending somebody to the moon. But we do not have not just a nuclear industry. We don't have nuclear engineers. We don't have a Navy with people who know how to manage a nuclear vessel. And this is all going to have to be learned. And, I have concerns about, getting this right and whether or not we can all even do it. Now, another concern for me, and as was said at the start by Sue, I have an interest in climate change and security. And that book, by the way, was just published last week. Nuclear-powered submarines prioritize security from a state-on-state, China against us perspective. And these vessels are completely useless in a climate change setting. And to me, climate change is the #1 threat, and we're ignoring it and prioritizing a secondary threat. I've already mentioned the cost, which is immense. And it's, I'm not saying that this is money that could be better spent towards schools or hospitals, which it could be, but it also could be spent towards other defense capabilities that just make more sense for our security and our independent security. And lastly, it will do nothing to advance Australia's sovereignty. The government makes a deal about having a sovereign shipbuilding industry, whereas we have hosts of other industries that are much more important. And many of you probably have the same experience as I have of when you go into the pharmacy or to the chemist and you get your prescription filled and not a single one of those medicines are made in Australia. Something like that could be more useful. The industry that I suggest that we should develop as a sovereign capability would be microchips, because they are in everything. And if you want to have a high technology country, you need access to them. But what to do instead? So I would call for that we need to rebalance these 3 security priorities and put them into this sort of order: shaping the region first, participating in international organizations, and putting the seeking of the protection of the big partner last. Now, I'm not going to say that we shouldn't be part of alliances, but we need to be part of alliances in which we've thought through the consequences of it. And that is the security option of last resort. And if we shape the region more favorably, if we participate in international organizations more intensively, then the degree to which we need the protection of that big partner becomes less, leaving us, I think, with more options, better options to how we protect our security. So what to do instead? Well, instead of getting things like, nuclear-powered submarines, and, you might have seen in the papers today or in some of the online journals today that now there's a call for Australia to acquire the B-21 bomber, which will cost about $500 million each. Instead of buying these kinds of platforms, we should create a layered defense that to our north, so that we can interdict the approaches of any adversary who is coming in Australia's direction with hostile intent, and also working with the regional, the other nations in the region who would also fear this adversary. And to do this layered defense, we would need to invest in things like missiles, which are coming, but are coming in a fairly minimal number. Nautical mines, these are anti-shipping mines. Now, we have none. Drones, we have no armed drones. Conventional submarines, which can be deployed into the region, to the straits to our north, and which would not be suitable to service off the coast of China. I don't have on that list, but also uncrewed maritime submarines, smaller submarines that could operate independently of a crew, and lots of small ships, because any big ship will be found and destroyed by the adversaries' anti-ship technologies, much in the same manner that we're trying to do. And lots of small ships actually have a much greater usage, much greater ability to intervene in the region in that climate change scenarios, which would be the one I would also be emphasizing. Now, I am not suggesting this because it'll save money. And I have no idea. I'm not a financial person. I'm not a historian of economics. So I don't know if this would save money, but would be investing in something that is actually more useful, more under control of Australia, that will give us greater independence from the big partner and allow Australia to make its own decisions about how it interacts with not only with the region, but also how it responds to potential threats to our sovereignty. So I know we're supposed to talk for a brief time, so that's all I'll say for now. And I look forward to the discussion to come.
Thank you very much, Al. That was very well presented, very clear, compelling. Not to say that everyone's going to agree on every point, and I'm sure you wouldn't expect that, but very clear arguments, which we greatly appreciate. So thank you for that. Now, I would, as I mentioned, we're going to save up the questions for the end, so keep them coming if they're in the chat. And I would like to introduce Dr. Mike Gilligan, our second speaker. Mike worked for 20 years in defence policy and evaluating military proposals for development, including time he spent in the Pentagon on military balances in Asia. He's authored a number of articles, including titles, Our Defence Minister Spurns Realism Imperiling Australia. He's written also AUKUS is not about defending Australia, but a possible US attack on China. And he's written again on AUKUS and Submarines, a slippery slope. Mike is a strong believer in our ADF's ability to defend territorial Australia without foreign assistance. So Mike, we're really looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Sue. Well, I guess it's a case of preaching to the converted for me. And I might just go way back to where we started. The aims of this organization is to have the official policy of the government as a self-reliant defence capability for Australia. And my observation on that is that we already have that. We've had that officially since the White Paper of 1976. The reasoning behind that is interesting. It's interesting probably to dwell a little bit on how we got to that point in 1976, even though we had not long before that signed the ANZUS Treaty with the United States of America. I think that was signed in about 1952 in San Francisco. So 20 plus years after that, we decided that we would have a self-reliant defence force. And while we may have treaty obligations, any money we spent would go into our own idea of what we needed for the self-defence of Australia. Anything that we put into alliance efforts would be drawn from that investment that we'd made for our own defence. So Al, you can see that I have quite a different conceptual start point to you in this, and I'm saying to you that we've been doing this for a lot of years, mate. We've been thinking about this for a lot of years, and a hell of a lot has happened in that time. Let me just go back to why we got to that position. So shortly after, the politicians had made much about this alliance. Somebody read the fine print, and the Minister for Foreign Affairs who negotiated this was a fellow called Percy Spender, who's the grandfather of the Teal Spender, who was recently the grandfather of her, who was recently elected to office in the last election. That's just by and by. He tried very hard to get a guarantee from the Americans that they would come to our aid if we were attacked, and we would come to their aid if they were attacked. Essentially, that is the essence of the NATO treaty, in Article 5 of the NATO treaty. The Americans wouldn't give us that. They said, that is not something we're prepared to commit to, but we'll help you. We'll help you along the way with equipment and intelligence and cooperation and that sort of thing, but we're not going to commit to come to your aid. Well, sometime after that, there was a lot going on in South Asia with the creation of Malaysia and communist insurgency in Malaysia, and the involvement of Indonesia in all of that in something that is called confrontasi. And it was in the early 60s, I think, that came about. So that's about 10 years later. Australia felt threatened by Indonesia in that. The British were involved in, and we were involved militarily in Malaysia, trying to support the new state of Malaysia. So we were quite stretched with that. And as we were involved in that, the Americans, we went to the Americans and said, you know, will you support us in this? And they said, no, we've got other things that we're thinking about. And that turned out to be Vietnam. So at that point, the Americans said to us, we're not going to come to your support. We're not going to give you any guarantees at all. On top of that, we want a commitment from you to help us in Vietnam. So there was a double whammy there. And that set a lot of people thinking. We all know the story about Vietnam, about how that started with a fairly small commitment of advisors and a small group of people, and how it ended up 10 years later with, you know, we had a battalion up there, and we ended up with 3,000 dead out of that. That caused a lot of people to think very hard in Australia about what we really do about our defence. And out of that came a very well argued paper called the Defence Review of 1972, which met various degrees of acceptance and obstacles politically, but it got tabled in the Parliament as a thought piece, if you like. And enough people saw it, and enough people thought it was inevitable, it was ineluctable that we had to move in that direction. it was taken up. It was taken up by the Whitlam Labor government, and then it was taken up finally when it was penned by the new Liberal government, and Jim Killen was the minister that did that. So since 1976, we have unanimously, bipartisanly agreed that we have to be prepared to defend this country by ourselves. That, of course, was a rather traumatic thing. The mechanism by which we would do that had been thought about. We decided that we could no longer put up with having three separate defenders in the three separate military services, each defending Australia in its own way, had its own thoughts on how to defend Australia. We had just witnessed various ridiculous estimates of what it would take to defend Australia from each of them. So there was a banging of heads, and the three services and the whole lot, the Department of Supply, the whole lot, was put together in an integrated Department of Defence and an integrated Defence Force, Australian Defence Force. The only trouble with that was, as it has turned out, it is a big trouble, is that we didn't do what the Canadians did and get rid of the services as well, so that we had a truly joint military organisation. That's been a bugbear ever since, but that's a bit beside the point. So at that point, we had no idea how to proceed on that, and a mechanism was set up within the administrative structure of defence that we'd use a very blunt tool that, as the equipment that we had in the Defence Force wore out, and we had to face expensive decisions about what to do about it, that as a basis would work in a mechanistic way. We'd think about that proposition, that amount of money, as in this new context. Like, is it relevant to defending Australia? Yeah, is it of great value, or is it of marginal value? The first major decision that came up in that was the Navy decided their aircraft carrier was wearing out, and they wanted a new aircraft carrier. And after a hell of a lot of analysis on defence of Australia, contingencies in defending Australia in all sorts of ways, including a lot of the ideas that Al was painting there, they were all worked through fairly thoroughly in the 1980s, or before the 1980s. And it was eventually decided that the aircraft carrier, seaborne aircraft carrier for Australia, was not really something that we would be prepared to put a lot of money into, and it would cost a lot of money, because most of the things that it could do, almost everything it could do, we could do with land-based aircraft. And we already had a lot of land-based aircraft. We'd already invested in the F-111s for maritime strike. We had the Orions for anti-submarine warfare, for wide area surveillance. So it was that sort of basic economic reasoning that went on. Every issue that came up over the next 25 years was looked at in terms of what does this thing contribute to the defence of Australia. So we got to understand more and more about what it was we were missing in the defence of Australia, and what it was we had too much of, and made judgments about how much was enough. The big problem that we had there was we're a very large country with sparsely settled, with a lot of water around us, and we didn't have a clue what was going on around us. You could fly an aeroplane into Australia and nobody would ever know. You could fly it in 500 times, fly it in and out, and nobody would detect it if it didn't want to be detected. So it was very difficult to think about building a defence force when you didn't have any real handle on when things were coming at you, to put that in crude terms. Again, I don't know how I'm going for time, but Sue, maybe you can give me a bit of a hit.
Probably just a couple of minutes more, Mike.
Yeah.
Thanks.
That big barrier was removed in the 1980s when we became convinced that we could use a technology called skywave radar, over the horizon radar, which would enable us to be able to get complete transparency on our airspace out a long way out from our shores, both in the air and on the sea. So we experienced this quantum leap in capability just from that very, very basic step. Since then, that piece of technology has been refined. Technology has come along. Signal processing has got a lot better, so it is more and more refined. And we are now, if you like, on the same level as a superpower like America has. With America went this way originally, and then decided that it'd be better off doing it by satellite. So it's got two very deep satellites which work off infrared tracking. So we have the capability that America has to see what's going on around us with our own independent means of doing that. So I mention that because with all the talk of being interoperable with America and what a great thing that is, there are a lot of dangers in that as well, because to the extent that we get pulled away from this idiosyncratic system that we've got of looking after ourselves with this rather idiosyncratic technology which nobody else has got, then we run a very great danger of if and when the Americans decide they're no longer interested in this part of the world, then we'll find ourselves gutted without much at all. That hasn't given you, I haven't even begun to cover the topic of what level of capability we have now, but I'll just maybe summarize that by saying we have airfields and bases that have been deliberately situated in particular places. We bought aircraft, we bought sensors, we bought weapons to complement them, which give us a very, very effective, very high probability of being able to intercept aircraft and ships coming into this country. So I might just leave it at that, Sue.
Okay, good. Thanks very much, Mike, for that very useful potted history of what's gone before and some of the in previous decades, which a lot of us would not have been aware of. So thank you for that. I'm just going to run through a couple of the comments that have come, and then some questions. And I'm sorry if I'm overlooking anything. I probably will, but there we go. I do my best. There was some early comment about the Defence Strategic Review, which has been initiated and is taking submissions up until October 30, I think is the date. And there's a website whereby you can have a look at terms of reference, etc. And please make a submission on that, because that's going to be an important one, especially I think on the issue of the submarines. There was a comment from Margie Beavis about the proliferation dangers from the nuclear submarines, in addition to the other risks that you outlined, Al, with the nuclear submarines, risks and various degrees of idiocy. but the proliferation dangers from the highly enriched uranium is an extremely significant factor. There was a comment about needing a different organization from ASPI, which a lot of us would be aware is funded by US government, State Department, Defense Department, weapons companies, and the like. Now, to come on to questions, Jonathan Pilbrow asked a question about drones, stating a particular concern on his part living near Pine Gap, living in Alice Springs. And I saw your comment. I can't remember the question, Jonathan. Was it, Jonathan, would you like to unmute and just say in one sentence what the question was, please?
Oh, look, essentially the question is, what role does Albert see potentially for armed drones to be used by the ADF? I noticed that Albert said that we don't have any. I'm comfortable with us not having any, but I'm just interested in Albert's response to that.
Thanks, Jonathan. Albert has gone incognito. Are you there, Al?
Yes, I forgot to unmute myself.
That's good. That's good. Now we can hear you. We can't see you.
Yes.
There we go. Thank you.
Yes, you know, armed drones exist on quite a number of different levels. You know, we've seen the US being able to execute people anywhere in the world. And I deliberately use the word execute because these people don't receive any trial or anything. And often they are, you know, perhaps civilians too. So I don't see Australia acquiring that kind of capability or using them in that way. However, I do see that on the battlefield, the utility of armed drones being able to be used by Australian forces, either on the air, the sea, or on the land, in a combat situation, both to add another dimension to how they defend and attack against the enemy. So I think they're coming. We don't have any yet. I'm pretty confident that they're going to be coming, but I hope we limit them to what in the business they call tactical ones, as opposed to the ones that have global reach that the US uses for assassination.
Thank you very much, Al. I suspect a number of us might share Jonathan's concerns given the track record of drones, but we greatly appreciate you bringing that to our attention, Al, and for that comment. So thank you. Another question from Annette Brownlee was, I'm going to paraphrase Annette, I think it was to the effect of, should Australia perhaps consider joining the non-aligned movement? Would either of our speakers like to address that one? And Richard has a hand up. Al or Mike, would you like to talk about?
I'm happy to speculate on that, Sue.
Thanks.
I mean, the practical, you know, the practical politics mean that we're not going to dump the ANZUS alliance. There's a lot of benefits in the ANZUS alliance for Australia, in the same way that there are a lot of benefits in the ANZUS alliance for America. Even if it was followed to the letter, and we didn't, our politicians didn't take us off into every adventure that America cooks up. I don't think we would be. I don't think we'd be wise to pull out of that and say we're not going to be aligned with anybody.
Good eye. Thanks, Mike. Would you like to add to that, Al, or happy for us to move on?
Yes, I mean, the problem with joining the non-aligned movement is that it works as long as you feel that you're perfectly secure. And then if you feel that you're no longer perfectly secure, and then you have to do the heavy lifting all by yourself, which Australia may not be able to do. So I think to a certain extent, we do require to be in an alliance situation, but alliances have different conditions. And the ANZUS alliance was negotiated over 70 years ago, and I think it needs a revisit. And we need to look more closely at that, and come up with an alliance that is more relevant for Australia in its contemporary situations.
Great. Thank you very much, Al. I'll move on to the next question in a moment. I just noticed, Richard Bronowski, you have a hand up.
Yes, I do.
Which all right, I'll come back to you, Richard, because I'll do a couple of questions first and I'll come back to you. Please, everybody, be aware, I can't see all the hands because I can't fit everyone on the screen. So if you want to make sure you don't get overlooked, please put a question in the chat, but I'll come back to you shortly, Richard. Next question for Albert. Who could do the analysis to estimate the costs of your principle-based proposed restructure of the ADF? This is important because an explicit assumption is that self-defense would be cheaper than our current security spending, let alone the additional cost of an AUKUS. So the question is, who could do the analysis to estimate the costs of the restructure?
Defense has quite considerable finance resources, and as I replied directly in the chat, I think defense can do that. What they would have to do first is decide this is how we're planning to defend the country, this is the kind of systems that we would need, and then do a costing on it, plus also figure out what kind of people we require, how many, and what skill sets are required. So I'm not trying to underestimate how complex it is, because it is. But defense does this all the time when they're buying a new piece of equipment, and they look at the cost of this piece of equipment over 20, 30 years into the future. And they figure out exactly how many people they require, and they need to build new buildings up. So it would be a massive undertaking, but I think defense is quite capable of doing it. Now, the answer, I'm just guessing here. It would not surprise me if it would require a higher expenditure by the Australian government on Australian defense. I very much doubt it would. Sorry, that's too strong. I would be surprised if it came in at, would lead to a reduction or any kind of reorganization dividend that could be reallocated elsewhere.
Okay, thank you very much, Al. Next
Could
question.
Could I just add to that, Sue?
Yeah, yes,
very
yes,
briefly.
please do. Yes,
please
do.
I would be surprised if we couldn't save a vast amount of money if we really were sat down and had a blank sheet of paper, and we didn't have to worry about service sensitivities. We didn't have to worry about the parasitic industry that we have clinging, being fed by the defence vote. We could save a huge amount of money, and we could be far more secure. I have no doubt about it.
That's very pleasing to hear. Thank you very much, Mike. Thanks to both of you for that one. Next question. Again to Albert, although both of you, I'm sure, will be welcome, about conventional submarines acting independently of a crew. Do you, Albert, mean the new technology being investigated using artificial intelligence capable of launching missiles and outsourced to private companies to build, ?
Well, I'll start at the end of that. Essentially, most military equipment, particularly the ones used by Australia, since we don't have a sovereign nationally owned capability, are already purchased from private companies, or from, largely from overseas. So my expectation is that if we were to get uncrewed, conventionally powered submarines, that yes, they would be made by a private company, contractor, perhaps internationally or domestically. I don't know. but since it would almost certainly be that kind of situation. Now, with the first half of that question, artificial intelligence is always a difficult question because nobody quite really understands what it means or has a definition of it. But I would still see that that there is what they call the human in the loop, so that this weapon system, this submarine, is not sailing around the ocean, acting independently of oversight from a human back in Australia. There would be a communication link between Australia and the vessel, and that vessel would still be controlled and would still act upon instructions from a human. But it would be able to sail and maneuver without a crew on board.
Thank you very much, Al. That human in the loop is very good to hear, an essential piece. Thank you. Richard, over to you. Question from Richard Bronowski.
More a comment, Sue, a couple of comments. Firstly, submarines. We had Oberon submarines that could go anywhere in Southeast Asia, right up through the South Pacific. We don't need nuclear submarines, mainly because that would make us completely dependent on American technology. Already our armed forces are integrated into the United States Armed Forces, and I doubt that we could pull back from that so that we could say to the Americans, if you attack China over Taiwan, we're not going to join you. When you look at what the Labor Party has done since it came to office, you see that Penny Wong and Richard Marles and Albanese himself have all had contact with their Chinese opposite numbers, but it hasn't got very far. It seems to me that we're heading into a crisis. The crisis was more or less engendered when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan recently and caused an enormous reaction from China, who surrounded Taiwan with armed forces and was just about to attack them. Jim Molan, former general and senator, has now written a book in which he suggests that a crisis is just about to come, a second Pearl Harbor, not Japan this time, but China, and that China could strike at American forces in the Western Pacific with impunity and put them out of action before attacking and invading Taiwan. Now, this is the alarmist sort of nonsense that is being promoted by the right wing in Canberra. Peter Jennings of ASPI, Peter Dutton when he was Defence Minister. It's all developing into, I think, an almost hysterical anti-Chinese threatened feeling in Australia. And it's absolutely unnecessary. So I won't go any further. You want me to stop at that stage. But I want to say that, quite frankly, I think we've got a lot of things wrong with frigates and destroyers and submarines and other things too. I'd love to discuss it in more detail.
Okay, thanks very much, Richard. Good stuff there. Okay, next question is to Mike. Speaking of things we need and don't need, question is, do we need the 75 Abrams tanks for self-defense?
Well, it's interesting you should raise that, because I was interested in Albert's list. Al's list of 5 things I think you had, Al. Anything from missiles down to small ships. Nowhere did I see any reference to the army. I'm a bit, I was quite taken with that, because all the years that I've been involved with defence, the army has been utterly confused and paralysed about its role in defence of Australia. In the early days, when we didn't have any visibility at all of what was going on around us, it was decided by the army, not by the army, but by other people who sat around a table, the military in general, with a lot of analysts, that we needed a very highly mobile army that could move and cover space very quickly, but would be very lightly armed. The army was very lukewarm about that, and they said, "Well, we'll give you one brigade like that. But the others we need, because we need to have what is a proper army. We need tanks. We don't know what we're going to do with them, but we need them to be a proper army. And you can have the tanks in a number of levels up to a mechanized type of arrangement. And I went to the trouble of trying to work out what Army thinks it's doing now, and looked at some of its official documents, and they're still utterly confused about their role. If you look at what they actually exercise at, they're exercising in amphibious operations with US Marines, which means they want to go across somebody else's beach. But and that, I think, is the role that they see for these Abrams tanks. They're not going to be moved around in Australia for the defence of Australia. There is some pie in the sky notion that they will work with Marines to go across the islands in up around and off China. I don't know. That's speculation on my part, just trying to read between the lines.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. And that I think has sort of covered one of the next comments, questions, which was there about balance between maritime and air defence and ground forces as well, which you've focused our attention on. So thank you for that comment. There's no peaceful future in ANZUS, and to maintain that we should remain in it in today's bellicose climate is a recipe for war. We comment from Alison Bronowski, we would not be acceptable to the non-aligned movement because we are allied. From Grey Southern New Zealand, question, how important is it to know who is likely to attack you and what are the means of attack they might use given the rapid change of technology? Would anybody like to answer that? We have got about 26 new messages. So I'm going to ask our speakers if they want to focus on the questions I present or move along.
I'm happy to move along.
Okay, let's move along from that one. This one from Annette Brownlee about the best mix of ground forces. I think Mike's talked about that. Question, how many observer non-aligned movement are there? There's quite a bit of detail put in the chat line, which I think it might be better if we let you all have a read of. Russia is an observer country. Okay. Comment, the Swiss spend less than half of what Australia does of its GDP on self-defense. Okay, a question for Albert. Do you believe with climate change is due to, not sure about this one, is due to chemtrails and or HAARP, H-A-A-R-P. Do you want to comment there, Al, or should we move along?
Yeah, let's move along.
Move along, okay. Alison Bronowski says Russia is non-aligned, so is China. Annette Brownlee, would we not consider Russia and China to be in a sort of alliance currently? Any takers for that one? We'll move along.
I'll just make a comment there. I mean, they're technically not aligned, or there's no actual alliance, but sometimes interests converge. And so at the moment, interests are converging. But in the future, that may no longer be the case.
Good eye. Thank you. All right. There's a bit of commentary on Russia, whether Russia is non-aligned or not. I'll let you all read that if you'd like to comment. Please read Kevin Rudd's book, The Avoidable War. Thank you, Joe Valentine. Greg Bond, fully agree with Richard. Good eye. And Penny Lockwood, excellent, Richard. Thank you, Richard Bronowski. From Peter Lim, Peter Jennings was a strong supporter of apartheid South Africa and a Cold War warrior. It is hosted on ABC regularly. Comment there. a bit more comment about alliances, which I think we might move along from. A bit of comment about BRICS, which I think we'll move along from. Sorry, folk, I'm just reading as we go. There's some website about military service in Switzerland. Question from Martha Ansara. Is it true that as long as we host the joint bases and Darwin facilities, we are perceived and indeed are in alliance with the US? Or is this not true?
Yeah, Sue, well, you know, we're already in an alliance with the US, and by hosting US forces in the Darwin area, we're just, you know, making that even more abundantly clear that we have an alliance with the US.
Yeah, thank you.
Could I just say that
Yes.
there is a school of thought that there's more to the exercising than the odd opportunity to share skills. There is and refine skills. There is a growing argument that the US is working on a long, purposeful plan to strategically base its forces in Australia for the containment of China. And this is a very, very profound proposition. I think we'll know something more about that when this report that the Navy is doing for the basing of nuclear submarines, which is due out sometime early next year. The Navy is looking at bases on the East Coast, somewhere between Brisbane, Newcastle, and Wollongong. They're the candidate places. One of those places will be recommended by the Navy to build basing for these nuclear submarines. These nuclear submarines, that will be Australia's nuclear submarines, but the AUKUS statement made it quite clear that American submarines would be staging through there. These submarines are used by America as a second strike capability against China in a nuclear conflict. And that would mean that our southeastern part of Australia would become a high priority nuclear target for China if that was to come about. So there is a lot to think about in this basing and this exercising that is going on at the moment. It's becoming more active, more frequent. We're finding B-2 bombers and those sorts of things just hanging around on tarmacs in Amberley. And there is a very strong argument that we ought to have a really profound look at, you know, where this is all leading. And is it leading to us being a forward base, the forward base for containment of China? So it's not just Darwin, and it's not just way out in the middle of the centre of Australia that's affected.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike. And I think you've probably nailed the one of the big things that we're not being told, which is the sort of don't know about the word revolution, but the huge scale of the changes that are underway at the moment, which place enormously more risk on Australia, and not for our benefit, but for our allies' alleged benefit. So thank you for that neat little summary. Now, I think I've lost my place, but I'm going to try to find it. There's a question for a question for Al. Would you be able to give us an idea about the politics within the ADF and the ADO regarding the current trajectory outlined by the government, both with AUKUS and the $270 billion projected spend outside of AUKUS? So
I really just don't have the information to be able to answer that in an intelligent way. We know virtually nothing about AUKUS other than what was announced, and there's a great reluctance to actually, tell us where it's going or where the boundaries are on what AUKUS will be. And the same thing with the expenditure. So I'm just not privy to that kind of information, and so I really can't comment.
Okay, good eye. Thanks, Al. Question from Ross Guitha. Could Mike give us a brief picture of how the defence structure, which we believe you were part of, and which analysed the best defence capabilities and spending, how was this dismantled after the 1990s? And could you see that being reconstituted today?
In short, I left before it was dismantled, so I can't speak firsthand from that. I have no idea how the current Secretary of Defence or any Secretary of Defence fulfills their obligations to oversee the efficient allocation of taxpayers' resources when they don't have the tools. The tools that they have that they need have been abolished. Could it be reconstituted, and should it be reconstituted? Something has to be reconstituted which puts the military proposals on the table in an independent, in a forum which is they're analysed independently. That is not happening at the moment. The military are analysing and putting their own proposals forward, and they will go to us, as I can only deduce, they go to a secretary who has a very thin grasp of what he is actually approving.
Thank you very much, Mike. Yeah, I think we're all aware of the pretty terrible record of whatever due diligence there is over expenditure, etc. Alrighty, some comments from Joe Valentine about the US having 700 bases around the world, and Australia hardly cracks a mention, but we operate like another US military base. And comment from Jenny Durand: I don't know any person who wants a war. Almost everyone I know fears there will be a war. So we have the majority behind us in our quest for peace, how to harness that energy. Huge question, Jenny. We're going to take that on board. Okay, a few more comments which I'll let you read for yourselves. New nuclear mines proposed in WA. Question from Martha Ansra to either or both of you. Do you agree with Hugh White's position in his quarterly essay, Sleepwalk to War, Australia's Unthinking Alliance with America? I think we're probably all familiar with Hugh White's position. I don't know if you've read his quarterly essay, and if so, if you'd like to comment.
Well, I've read it, Sue, quite some time ago, and I think it's a pretty good breakdown of the issues. And I think where he comes out at the end is pretty right.
Right. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah. If I could just add, perhaps my only real objection to you is the term unthinking. I think the government does think this through, and they're just not the implications of their decisions. They don't quite realize the how difficult or how bad things could get by entangling themselves this way. But I think they're just, doing their default setting of, okay, this is the big partner. This makes Australian security easy because we don't have to think hard about this. The United States will protect us, and therefore, I, as the the Minister for Defense, I don't really have to spend a lot of time thinking. So it's a very easy, it's a very seductive approach by Australia, and it's very deliberate. It's not an accident on Australia's part. And should we change it? Absolutely. And we should start thinking really deeply about the implications of these steps that we're taking, which we're taking sort of blindly. But it's not an accident. It's quite deliberate.
Thanks. Mike, did you want to add to that, or we'll move along?
Yeah, I think we'll move along. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I've lost my place again, but I did see a question about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which I think is a really important one to focus on. So any, I was going to say, comment about your views on it, prospects for Australia signing, given that the current government stated when in opposition that they would sign and ratify when next in government, which is now. Although we haven't seen action on that since they came to power, and the NPT review meeting, which is just finalising in New York now, Australia didn't exactly shine in relation to furthering nuclear disarmament there. So, any comment on the TPNW? Mike? Or
I don't really have anything authentic to say on that. I don't think, Sue.
Okay, fair enough. Al?
No, let's just move along.
Move along. Okay. All right. Comment from Joe Valentine about nuclear submarine accidents. Question from Derek Burke: would US nuclear submarines also use this Australian nuclear submarine base located on the East Coast, making it in reality subservient to US strategic warfare purposes? Good question. If we have a nuclear submarine base on the East Coast, would it be used by US nuclear submarines?
Well, that was the thrust of what I was saying. They've already, the words that has come out in some of the AUKUS releases is that American submarines will be able to visit. Well, that's, I think it is, the only way you can explain these nuclear submarines is if we set up a base for nuclear submarines here that service the American needs to and their nuclear warfare strategies against China. The big question mark over all of that is, why is Australia spending the $100 plus dollars on these submarines when all they've got is conventionally armed weapons? They're what Paul Keating calls toothpicks. It's like throwing toothpicks at a mountain, said Paul Keating, and he's exactly right. Nobody in their right mind would invest vast amounts of money to throw a bit of high explosive a couple of 100 miles. The reason the Americans and the British are prepared to pay vast amounts for these highly expensive, highly capable submarines is because they can throw nuclear weapons. And that's the only reason the cost can be justified, if you believe in that sort of way of behaving. But it is just an economic absurdity that Australia would spend that amount of money to throw a bit of high explosive.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, I think, yeah, Mike, you're absolutely right. This is a vast expenditure for, maybe at most $1,000 pounds of TNT. Just to go back to the visiting rights of the U.S. vessels, this is something that governments negotiate. There have been plenty of U.S. vessels, U.S. Navy ships have visited Australian ports in the past, aircraft carriers, amphibious ships, destroyers. They just, our government gives them permission. They come into the port. They have an open day. People can go on board and have a look. And I have no reason to not expect that the same would happen with submarines. So sure, I think if we do have it's a dedicated submarine base at some point, you would expect the U.S. Submarine to get permission to come visit, and it'll come in.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to start to move towards finishing off soon. But I wonder, Mike, now, if are there any questions you would like to ask of one another? Any discussion?
I wondered if, given that Al has worked so closely with the Army for so long, I wonder if you could explain to us, Al, what the Army thinks it's doing.
I'm just giggling here, Mike.
Sorry.
Sorry, I muted myself. Yeah, it is a fair question, Mike. And Army is, I think, in a position where they are starting to look at the future and make some sensible decisions about where they need to go. And many of those things that I put on that list, like the missiles, I see those as being land-based and owned by Army, because that's the cheapest way to deploy these systems. So I think Army is actually in a better position rationally than it's been for a long time, but there's still a lot of work to do there. And understand that Army and Navy and Air Force, they respond to government direction. And part of the problem that part of the reason, or one of the reasons why we're in the situation we're in, is that our government really doesn't have a plan for the security of the country, other than we'll rely on the U.S. And that's a pretty shallow plan. So unless the political leadership starts giving some very hard directions and doing some very hard thinking, all three services are still going to struggle about just what the hell they're supposed to do.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I think before summing up, and there's more comment coming in, so please read it, folk. I'm afraid I'm not able to keep up with all the comment, but I think we're going to start wrapping up. And I wonder, Al and Mike, whether each of you would like to make any final comments, particularly by way of summary and messages that you would really like us to go away with. Firstly, Al.
Yeah, I'm continuing to drill into this whole issue of what our future security policy should look like, and right now we don't really have a philosophy of how we think about defense, because we just default to the great power partner. And one of the things I'm continuing to unpack is looking at if Australia was to adopt a philosophy of defense, of what military people call the strategic defense, and how that would change the Army. And that'll be the subject of my next book, which I'm only just beginning to start to think through. But so I'm going to continue to work in this space and continue to think about what the future security situation of Australia should be.
Great.
Over to you, Mike.
Very, very reassured to hear that. Thank you, Mike.
Well, I obviously wasn't very convincing if Al thinks that all we've ever done is default to the Americans. I take utter issue with there. You ought to go and do a bit of reading, Al, of government white papers and things like that. You do yourself a big favour before you've got somebody to publish a book that said exactly the opposite. I think we've made a lot of strides in thinking about how we can defend this country by ourselves independently. I think we've got to cling to that. It's very precious. There are a lot of forces that are trying to erode it. And there's a lot of money at stake, and there are extreme dangers for it, for the government politically, in treading, in trying to tread delicately along that path of getting the Americans used to the idea that we really are serious about being able to do things by ourselves. I think that's the real challenge that this country faces at the moment. I think, I suspect we have a chance with this government. We had absolutely no chance with the previous government. We would have been just completely engulfed by the Americans in a restructure which made war with China the focus of our defence. We have to fight that as hard as we can, and so that we stick with doing what we can with China, diplomatically, first of all. The government's talking about a reset. I think it's very important that defence and everybody goes out of their way to make that objective of resetting relations with China a priority. And I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thank you both very, very much. If I could just wrap up and probably throw in a few of my own biases as well. And sort of agreeing, Mike, that with the new government, we do have new opportunity, although observing also that they don't seem to be doing very much very differently from the government that we had before. So I think we still have huge challenges. And I mentioned the nuclear weapons issue, which you identified, Al, as the existential, along with climate change, the existential threat that we face, which was far, far, far greater than any threat from China. So I think we want to keep that nuclear weapons threat pretty much top of mind, and that came up in the chat line also, and particularly keeping the pressure on the government to sign and ratify the nuclear weapons ban treaty. I think it was Martha Answer who made a comment, which was perhaps one of the most important questions of all. How can we engage in a public campaign to get these issues on the public agenda more? And I think that's really, really important, which we can't do here and now, but that's something for all of us to think about and give our best efforts to, because ultimately we want to change things. We don't want to just talk about things, we want to change things. So how can we best go about doing that? And if I could, as I'm doing, toss in my own 2 cents worth about that. I think the issue of the nuclear submarines is probably our best leverage point at the moment, and the whole AUKUS debacle, which, as we've noted, we know virtually nothing about. Hardly anybody in the country knows anything about it, except it was an announcement sprung on the whole world a year ago. So I think focusing our attention on the nuclear submarines, what a disastrous thing they would be for our country, for our security, and in terms of nuclear weapons proliferation, I think that's a really good way for us to go. And remember again the Defence Strategic Review, and please put in a submission there. Just a bit of a promo for a few organisations, and I'm sorry I'll probably miss some, but again, big thank you to IPAN for organising this webinar and for all the splendid work that IPAN does in raising and campaigning around these issues. IPAN, not to be confused with ICAN, which is doing absolutely brilliant work on the nuclear weapons front, and please give your best support to ICAN as well. And also we have a few folk here from Australians for War Powers Reform, which is trying to change the way Australia can go to war, the decision-making process, and in particular, just trying to get some debate around these issues, which is what is sorely needed. So thank you all very much for coming. It's great to have all of you here. That was a fantastic discussion. I think we've all picked up a lot and we've got some new ideas to work with. So a big, we can't actually give it show of hands as we, well, applause as we used to, but anyway, please thank our two speakers. We were extremely pleased to have our Palazzo and Mike Gilligan. Thank you both very much for what you've brought to this session. And Annette, did you want me to hand back to yourself or someone else at IPAN, or are we closing now?
No, I think it's fine if we close now. It's been a really interesting conversation. And a big thank you to you, Sue, too, for managing a very busy chat line and trying to isolate those questions in amongst all the comments. It's quite a challenge, I know. And I really appreciate having Al and Mike share their thoughts and their knowledge as well. And this is another contribution, really, to the community dialogue that we need to have. And as I said in the chat just now, for all of us, you know, writing those letters to the editor, I think, and just kind of getting it out there that there are real concerns about the nuclear submarines and Australia's alliance that ties us in with yet more and more wars, and shall I say that the mother of all wars, if we were to go to war with America against China, it's the unthinkable that's now thinkable. So I think it's just a matter for all of us to keep up our work in talking, communicating, and organising events that you know, add to the disquiet and the dialogue in our community. So good night, everyone, and see you at the next webinar. We'll just let you know, we will be looking at a webinar where we do look at the non-aligned movement at some time in the future. And I see Jonathan wants to say a few words.
Just checking that you'll save the chat, because there was a lot of really interesting stuff.
I have done that. Yep. All right then. Good night. Go and have
Thanks,
your dinner.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.